We left off last video with a bit of refactoring and dipping our toes into project organization, which we'll get more in depth later. In this video, we're going to introduce the passing of the data and changing from day to night, like you see in this video, based on a Boolean, and start talking about state in Swift UI. All right, back to our code, our weather day view that we refactored. Let's go back up to the top. Let's add what's called a state variable, and I'll give you the quick explanation. But like I said, the bulk of this course is going to focus on, at state, at binding, at state object, at observable object, passing the data. So this is like just the very first steps of it. So don't get me wrong, this took me a long time to wrap my head around all the data flow in Swift UI. So in this app, if you leave this being like, I have no idea what's going on, don't worry, we're going to hammer this home over the next couple apps and throughout the rest of the course. So state private var is night, and that's going to equal false by default, right? So do Command B to get rid of any errors here. Okay, so big picture, again, we'll drill down later. The way Swift UI works is you don't directly update UI. You tell some source of truth, some piece of data. In this example, that source of truth data is this Boolean is night. So you set up your UI to handle if is night is true and if is night is false. And you can imagine we're going to change our background color based on is night true or false. So your UI is waiting for that change. And when that change happens, your UI is like watching that source of truth. And when that change happens, your UI will change. Like it's reacting to it, right? It's declarative programming versus imperative programming. I have a whole video in the next section all about that. But that's big picture, keeping it simple. So what we need to do is set up our UI to handle both cases. Like what happens if isNight is true and isNight is false, okay? So what we're going to do is just change the top color and bottom color on our gradient view. If you're familiar with ternary operators, we can do isNight, and then if it's true, we'll do .black, and if it's false, we'll do .blue, right? That's just for our top color. And then for the bottom color, because this is going to get too long, again, let's put our parameters on a separate line here. So same thing, is night, and it's going to be .gray if it's true, and if night is false, it's going to be light blue. So if is night is false, it's going to look just like we have it here. However, if is night is true, we're going to change it to black and gray. So let's try this out here. Down in our button, remember we just did button tapped. Now we're actually going to flip that Boolean. So we can do is night dot toggle. So no, not custom mirror. What are you doing, Xcode? Toggle. All right. So now when I tap the button, it's going to just toggle from true to false. And based on that, our UI is going to be watching it, and it's going to adjust our background gradient accordingly, right? So you can either run this on your device if you want, run it on the simulator, or the nice thing about previews, if you hit this play button and you'll see the background will change to this like grayish blue kind of thing, that means your app is like actually running and you can interact with it. So watch what happens when I tap the change daytime button. Bam, now it's into night, just like that. So what's happening is right now is night equals true. When I tap this, is night equals false. And now my UI knows that source of truth of data changed, and then it updates accordingly. Now let's make some small tweaks here. So if I go back to night, well, it's still sunny and cloudy at night. Well, that's a little weird. So let's go to our main weather status view, and the same thing we can do here, right? We can do is night. If is night is true, we don't want cloud sun fill. We want moon stars fill, right? You see it here? Or you can do just moon or whatever you want. Who cares, right? Sparkles, whatever you want to put in there. I'm going to do moon stars fill. Back to Xcode. Do Command V to paste that in there. So now if is night is true, we're going to show the moon. If it's false, we're going to show the cloud sun. Hit change daytime, and you'll notice I didn't have to stop my preview and restart it, right? It's hot reloading the code. So this is the nice thing about previews when they work. But you see now when we're going from day to night, we're also changing the icon back and forth, right? So that's pretty cool. So that is the very, very basics of how Swift's data flow works. Again, you have a source of truth, your data model, and when that changes, your UI updates. Now the trick is making sure you set up your UI properly and making sure the UI is, listening to the right stuff to update. And you got to make sure your model objects is publishing its information. You got to make sure like things are listening. So that's kind of the tricky part of it. Again, we'll get to that. One last thing, right? So we covered state. Now let me I'm going to dive into this later, but real quick, the reason you put state variable in front of it is if you're familiar with your structs versus classes like Swift 101, structs are value types. So they don't hold state, right? They get destroyed and recreated. So how can you make a struct hold state? Well, that's what this state property wrapper is for, right? So if you can imagine this view called content view is just a struct and it gets created and destroyed all the time, created and destroyed. That's what Swift UI is all about. Very cheap views that get created and destroyed, redrawn all the time. However, this little piece of this view called isNight, this little piece of data, this Boolean, has state in front of it. So that means that gets put off somewhere else to keep that state. While the rest of the view is constantly created and destroyed, this keeps state. So super basic explanation, but hopefully your mind is starting to see how like Swift UI works a little bit. Okay, so now onto that final piece I'm gonna talk about. We're gonna refactor background view even more so we don't have to like, this is kind of like messy, and it's gonna introduce binding. Okay, so let's go down to our background view. Okay, so we don't wanna use this, we don't wanna pass in a top color and a bottom color. We wanna pass in var is night, and that is a bool. Now, this isNight needs to keep state, like we just talked about, right? It needs to always know, am I day, am I night, what am I showing? Because again, this view could get recreated and destroyed. Now this isNight variable always needs to match this isNight variable, right? Because it's the same thing, right? This view is a child of that view, right? We're passing this isNight variable down the view hierarchy to the children. So they need to be the same at all times, right? So that's what binding is for. So if I put binding in front of at here, so binding var isNight, and then we're gonna have to do that logic here where isNight, this is what we just did before, dot black if isNight is true, if isNight is false, we do dot blue, and then let's delete top color because we're done there. And same thing with bottom color, again, isNight, if that's true, we're gonna use for the bottom color, dot gray, if it's false, color initializer name. Remember, this is exactly what we did up top. You could even copy and paste it if you like. So that way, every time we use our background view, like right here, every time we use background view, if we're using this, all throughout the app, we would have to pass in these kind of colors. Well, now background view just takes in a binding, right? isNight, but you can see it's not just a bool, right? It's a binding bool. So I can't just put isNight, right? Because it's not binding. Because down here in the background view, I specifically said this needs to be binding. And again, what binding does is makes it so my isNight variable on my background view is always the same as this isNight variable, right? So to do that, you put a $sign in front of it. So that makes it binding. So now I'm passing into my background view a binding to isNight, right? And then now here, so that means on my background view, this isNight is always going to be the same as this isNight. That's what binding does. So back down in the background view, we should be good to go here. And then again, it's just a little cleaner up here. Just background view isNight, you pass in isNight. So let's stop this just to be sure, rerun the preview. And now if we do this, it should work the same. Yep, it works the same. And that's a very basic example. I just wanted to introduce the concept of binding and how when passing it down, that's the key, passing it down the view hierarchy to the children, right? Because the background view here in this circumstance is a child of the content view, right? It's part of the content view. So we can pass the binding down the view hierarchy. Now, in more complex apps, you could imagine like you could be passing a binding down 6 views down the view hierarchy to use it. There's other ways, things like the environment, we'll get into that later. But again, this is the basic introduction of state and binding. Those are the 2 most basic ways to pass data. We're going to be doing that a lot throughout the rest of the apps, but this is your introduction. So that finishes off this weather app. I want to leave you with some challenges that you can take this app and go even further with it. Another challenge, and this is more towards those who have experience building Swift apps, create a data model that you don't have to individually pass in this stuff, right? You can have an array of like a day, right? And a day would have, a day of the week, a temperature, an image name, or maybe a weather enum that you pass in that has the specific image attached to it. You can make this neat and represent a data model that's a bit more, it's not advanced. It's kind of basic iOS knowledge. But if you are like a super beginner just learning Swift UI, that may be above it. But if you have app experience, you should be able to do that. So that'd be a good challenge. And then if you really want to take this far, create a network call from a basic weather API that will take whatever city you want and it'll actually give you the next 5 days of weather. That's taking it pretty far, but my goal here is to give you the basis of an app that you can tweak yourself, build upon, all that good stuff. Or maybe you put a tab view that shows 5 different cities based on that API. I don't know. Have a ball with it. Here's the basis. Those are some challenges you can do to push yourself. And if you have questions about those challenges, feel free to ask in the Slack channel. I'm sure plenty of people will help you out. So that wraps up the weather app. And again, if I went super fast, you felt like I was throwing a lot at you, this was just so you could see it in action. In the next section, I'm gonna do a lot of talking head explainer videos that do a deep dive into a lot of the theory and the concepts. But again, because you've seen it in action, now when I explain that stuff, hopefully that connection can be made. Whereas if I just started off explaining things and you never seen it in action, it's kind of confusing. So again, that was the purpose of this, just to give you a taste of it. In the future apps, we're going to go a little bit slower. We're going to dive into a lot of the details, and you're going to get a lot of practice and repetition because, to be honest with you, a lot of it's the same when it comes to like the UI and stuff. So, all right, we'll see you in the next section.